Beneath a sky heavy with humidity, colossal fungal towers pierce the mist, casting shadowed corridors across waterlogged terrain where the first forests struggle to rise. It is the Devonian, nearly 400 million years ago, a world of relentless heat, stagnant pools, and unseen predators that stalk the forest floor. Life teeters on the edge of innovation and extinction, evolving limbs, armor, and senses to navigate a swamp both nurturing and lethal. Here, before wings lifted the smallest creatures into the sky, the struggle for survival is raw, immediate, and mesmerizing. Step cautiously into this primeval wetland, where every shadow hides the secrets of life's earliest experiments. Swamps born from primeval heat. Across a planet still reshaping itself from Ordovician upheavals, the Middle Devonian swamps, formed as atmospheric carbon dioxide, hovered between 2,000 and 3,000 parts per million, trapping heat with an intensity that turned lowland basins into vast greenhouse hothouses, where humidity routinely approached saturation. Geological reconstructions indicate that equatorial regions experienced mean annual temperatures surpassing 30 degrees Celsius, and within enclosed marshlands, the trapped heat amplified thermal stress to levels rarely seen in later eras. This kind of climate promoted the rapid expansion of early plant lineages such as Zosterophyllum and Rhiniopsida, whose simple vascular structures thrived along shorelines that pulsed with rhythmic flooding dictated by monsoon-like precipitation cycles. Within these embryonic wetlands, the air thickened not only with heat, but with dense concentrations of water vapor, forming microclimates where evaporation and condensation occurred simultaneously across every available surface. Studies of Devonian paleosols reveal mineral crusts showing repeated wetting-drying cycles, evidence that these swamps experienced continual transitions between inundation and exposure. This oscillation controlled the distribution of bryophyte-dominated mats and shaped the morphology of early root systems, especially in plants like Aglaophyton major, whose rhizomes spread laterally in thin, fibrous networks designed to anchor themselves in waterlogged ground that routinely shifted under their weight. Around the margins of stagnant pools, chemical gradients formed as oxygen dissolved into the uppermost millimeters of the water column, leaving deeper zones nearly anoxic and heavily reduced in iron, sulfur, and ammonia. Laboratory studies of modern analog environments, meromictic lakes, and peat bogs demonstrate how such reduced conditions encourage the formation of hydrogen sulfide, and similar geochemical signatures appear in Devonian shale layers rich in pyrite framboids. These conditions created waters that trapped heat more efficiently than the atmosphere, and sediment cores from Devonian formations frequently show valved laminations, suggesting periods of intense stratification where convective mixing rarely reached the bottom. Beneath the canopy of primitive vegetation, early fungal communities expanded into a role far larger than their size suggested, decomposing cellulose-poor plant tissues with enzymatic pathways that represent some of the earliest steps toward terrestrial nutrient cycling. Fossils of prototaxites, towering fungal organisms rising several meters above the forest floor, hint at a Devonian world where decomposition had not yet reached modern efficiency, allowing organic material to accumulate faster than microbes could process it. The presence of lignin-degrading white rot fungi would not become widespread until much later, so these early wetlands trapped enormous volumes of plant biomass, creating thick mats of partially decomposed organic matter that altered water flow, redirected channels, and increased the risk of sudden ground collapse under the weight of accumulating peat. Suspended above these murky expanses, spore clouds billowed from plants whose reproductive strategies depended entirely on moist conditions, releasing billions of microscopic particles that drifted like pollen fog through the swamp's dim corridors. Spores from lycophytes such as Asteroxylon are found in exceptionally high densities within Middle Devonian sediment layers, and such concentrations would have significantly affected atmospheric optics by scattering sunlight and tinting the air in tones of amber, green, or even brown. These reproductive cycles were triggered by alternating wet and dry intervals, and their seasonal pulses may have produced predictable ecological rhythms similar to modern spore-driven allergenic cycles, but on a scale that influenced entire ecosystems. Through dim, sediment-laden waters, microbial mats composed of cyanobacteria and early algal lineages spread across submerged surfaces, forming cohesive films that competed directly with vascular plants for light and nutrients. Fossil evidence from the Rhynie chert shows microbial biofilms coating stream beds and shallow pools, preserving impressions of filamentous colonies that once stabilized sediments and shaped water chemistry by fixing nitrogen and producing extracellular polysaccharides. Such mats created slippery substrates that increased the risk of entrapment for any organism attempting to move across them, and their metabolic byproducts subtly shifted the pH of the surrounding waters, encouraging mineral precipitation and creating microhabitats with biochemical signatures detectable hundreds of millions of years later. At the edges of inundated hollows, the rise of the first true roots initiated geological processes that would transform entire continents. As these structures penetrated increasingly deep into the substrate and accelerated chemical weathering of silicate rocks. Devonian root systems from genera, like Archaeopteris, demonstrate early branching patterns and absorptive tissues capable of drawing nutrients from the soil while simultaneously destabilizing slopes and increasing sediment transport. Weathering rates during the Devonian are estimated to have increased by as much as 100% compared to earlier periods, contributing to long-term carbon sequestration and the eventual drawdown of atmospheric CO2 that would reshape global climates in the long run. Though in these swamps, in the moment, heat and humidity remained unrelenting. Along still channels where water moved only through capillary creep, early invertebrates exploited the stagnation, leaving behind cryptic trace fossils, burrows, surface trails, and delicate feeding marks etched into fine silt that settled during windless nights. Ichnofossils, attributed to early arthropods such as Palaeoscorpius, reveal foraging patterns centered around algal ridges and decomposing plant litter, suggesting that nutrient-rich detritus created hotspots of activity where competition for limited oxygen occasionally triggered mass die-offs. These microhabitats became laboratories of evolutionary experimentation, where survival hinged on adaptations to environmental instability rather than on dominance over specific ecological roles. Within deeper pools, where sunlight rarely reached, chemical stratification created zones that fostered the earliest complex interactions between microbial communities and sedimentary processes, leading to the formation of finely laminated black shales that now serve as windows into this submerged world. These deposits contain biomarkers of green sulfur bacteria, organisms adapted to low oxygen, sulfide-rich conditions that thrived in water bodies where vertical mixing was minimal. Their presence indicates that the Devonian swamps were not merely wetlands, but highly structured biochemical landscapes divided into layers of competing metabolisms, each functioning almost as an independent ecosystem within the broader matrix of heat and water. Far from being quiet, these swamps pulsed with invisible forces, evaporative fluxes, osmotic gradients, and hydrological surges that reshaped the terrain with every rise or fall in water level, leaving behind abandoned channels, and drowned thickets where new life quickly took root. Such dynamic systems encouraged rapid ecological turnover, and paleobotanical analyses reveal that plant assemblages shifted dramatically within relatively short geological intervals, responding to subtle changes in elevation, salinity, or sediment load. These fluctuations created pockets of opportunity that early terrestrial animals would eventually seize, venturing into the swamp margins where the ground quivered beneath their weight and the air shimmered with moisture rising from the saturated earth. And as the sun dipped behind towering fungal columns and the thick air settled into a heavy, unmoving haze, the swamps of the Devonian revealed their most haunting truth. They were places where life flourished only at the cost of perpetual tension, where every patch of ground and every stagnant pool harboured unseen forces shaping the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems. In that oppressive environment, the first large arthropods began to patrol the forest floor, sensing movements through vibrations in the waterlogged soil, and the stage was quietly set for the rise of ground-dwelling giants whose dominance would redefine the meaning of danger in this primordial world. Crawling giants of the forest floor. Shadows lengthen across the swamp floor as immense arthropods emerge from the cover of fungal pillars, their bodies glistening beneath a haze that traps every breath of moisture and heat within the Devonian lowlands. The ground trembles faintly beneath their weight, as fluid pressure within their segmented limbs allows movements both deliberate and powerful, each step compressing layers of silt enriched with spores, decaying tissues, and chemical residues of the organisms that came before them. In this world without aerial predators, the swamp substrate becomes a battleground of creeping dominance, where size, posture, and sensory acuity determine which creature advances and which one dissolves back into the soil's perpetual cycle of consumption. Towering above the leaf litter, Arthropleura-like ancestors reveal segmented bodies engineered for stability in treacherous terrain, with dorsal plates interlocking like natural armour to prevent crushing under their own mass. Although true Arthropleura belongs to a later Carboniferous ecosystem, their Devonian precursors show early expressions of gigantism that paleobiologists infer from trace fossils, meter-scale trackways pressed into fine-grained sediment that once formed the swamp's shifting pathways. Each segment houses paired tracheal openings that hint at the growing complexity of terrestrial respiration, despite the atmospheric oxygen still climbing toward values that would reach nearly 30% in future ages. Behind clusters of decaying stems, predatory forms such as early Paleoscorpius exhibit sensory organs adapted to detect the faintest tremor, using slit sensilla embedded in their exoskeletons to monitor shifts in pressure across the ground. Their pinching appendages carry evidence of differentiated musculature designed for both excavation and sudden attack, suggesting hunting strategies that blend stealth with explosive bursts of force. Fossil remains from Silurian and Devonian strata reveal compound ocular structures complex enough to decode light gradients even beneath dense canopy darkness, enabling them to track movement where visibility declines to almost nothing. On the waterlogged terrain, exoskeleton chemistry becomes a survival strategy, calcite, chitin, and lipids forming armour against physical hazards that include fungal decay, acidic peat layers, and the mandibles of rival invertebrates. The microstructure of these exoskeletons shows laminar layering, with cross-linked polysaccharide arrangements providing both flexibility and resistance to shearing forces. As decomposition released sulfuric compounds into standing water, arthropods, adapted by developing lipid-rich cuticles that could repel corrosive fluids, a trait confirmed by chemical analyses of preserved fragments from several Devonian deposits. Near drainage hollows, respiratory limitations dictate size, forcing these giants to depend on high atmospheric oxygen that surged during certain intervals of the Devonian, particularly late stages approaching 25% in some reconstructed models. Tracheal diffusion restricts the maximum thickness of their bodies, yet regional variations in humidity and oxygen solubility allow these creatures to push the limits of physiology. Fossil burrows discovered in Belgium and Scotland show chambers whose microstratigraphy reflects periodic occupation tied to oxygen fluctuations, revealing how arthropods relocated with atmospheric shifts to maintain adequate respiration. Between drifting mats of plant debris, territorial disputes leave gouges in silt that fossilize into ichnofossils, still visible in modern stone. Each groove a record of violent collisions between heavily armoured bodies. These traces reveal combat styles that include lateral shoves, claw-driven grappling, and rapid rotations meant to unbalance opponents on unstable soil. Researchers analysing trackway overlap patterns can reconstruct dominance hierarchies, with deeper impressions indicating heavier individuals likely favoured in confrontations, marking the origins of terrestrial power structures long before vertebrates claimed the land. Over ephemeral puddles rimmed with microbial biofilms, juvenile arthropods deploy miniature versions of adult adaptations, revealing developmental strategies preserved in growth rings etched into their exoskeletons. These fine bands, not unlike those found in tree rings, record cycles of nutrient availability, drought, or sudden influxes of organic debris. The smallest individuals feed on algae-rich mats that flourish in sunlight patches, penetrating the swamp canopy, establishing early trophic pathways that would expand as terrestrial ecosystems diversified. Within narrow corridors formed by toppled stems, stealth predators perfect ambush techniques, using stagnant water as an amplifier for vibrations produced by passing prey. Their elongated bodies taper into flexible tail segments able to strike with precision, delivering venom through hollow structures whose biochemistry preserved in Devonian fossils indicates early peptide-based toxins. These ambush specialists refine a style of hunting that relies less on vision and more on interpreting shifting gradients in pressure and chemical signatures, contributing to the evolutionary experimentation thriving in the darkness of the swamp floor. Beyond the trampling paths, competition with other invertebrates produces evolutionary arms races centered on speed, armor thickness, and enzymatic venom potency that escalates with each generation. Beetle line precursors develop hardened elytra, reinforcing dorsal protection, while millipede relatives adopt chemical defense, releasing benzoquinones that deter even the most persistent predators. In this confined world, where movement is constrained by mud, vegetation, and humidity, incremental advantages become amplified over time, shaping future terrestrial ecosystems through selective pressures that reward innovation. As dusk falls over the swamp, monstrous silhouettes ripple across the undergrowth, reinforcing how dominance on land was still an experiment in progress, filled with evolutionary trials that succeeded or collapsed in the face of environmental instability. The descending darkness joins with the swamp's vapor-thick atmosphere to distort outlines, making the giants appear even larger as they navigate the terrain in patient, deliberate motions. Each shadowed passage marks a moment in a broader evolutionary story, one in which terrestrial life tests the limits of physiology and strategy against the hazardous uncertainties of this ancient world. In the fading light, the giants retreat into the maze of plant-built shadows, hinting that their power was shaped not only by predatory instinct, but by the dark, towering vegetation that encircled them and quietly determined the opportunities available for survival. As their armoured bodies dissolve into the gloom between thickening stems, the landscape itself becomes the next revelation, suggesting that the world which nurtured such creatures was sculpted by forces even stranger and more imposing than the monsters that crawled upon it, urging us toward an exploration of the eerie botanical labyrinth, waiting deeper within the Devonian night. Labyrinths of the first forests. The last echoes of arthropod movement fade as shafts of diffused sunlight pierce the canopy, revealing the intricate corridors formed by towering lycopsids and primitive progymnosperms, whose branching stems crisscross to form near impenetrable walls of wood and leaf. These first forests, stretching across equatorial swamps, reached heights of 6 to 12 meters, creating a three-dimensional maze in which every pathway, every fallen stem, dictated the flow of life. Fossilized Archaeopteris specimens reveal leaf arrangements that maximize light interception while simultaneously fostering shadowed corridors where early predators could lurk unseen. The swamp floor, layered with silt, detritus, and decomposed vegetation, provides a substrate rich in nutrients yet treacherously unstable, shaping how animals navigated this dim, labyrinthine world. Thick mats of spore clouds hang in the air, scattering light and saturating the atmosphere with moisture that turns every leaf, stem, and fungal column into a potential hiding place. Paleobotanical analyses show that lycopsid and fern-like plants released billions of microscopic spores that persisted in the dense canopy, sometimes forming a semi-continuous haze across entire forest stands. These clouds not only limited visibility but also deposited nutrients as they settled, creating localized patches of fertile ground on trunks and logs that fostered microbial and algal growth. Airborne spores may have also influenced predatory behavior, allowing hunters to detect prey by the subtle displacements their movement caused within this nearly opaque fog. In the humid, low-light layer of the forest, early root networks intertwine with decaying litter, creating a complex lattice that channels water and shapes the movement of small predators and herbivores alike. Fossilized rhizomes of Archaeopteris and associated lycopsids suggest that these roots penetrated deep into floodplain sediments, stabilizing the substrate while simultaneously altering local hydrology. Water pooled along root channels, forming ephemeral puddles that became hunting grounds for tiny arthropods, while burrows and tunnels within this lattice provide refuge and feeding zones. These intertwined networks demonstrate the first large-scale engineering of terrestrial ecosystems by plants, with roots functioning both as structural anchors and as agents shaping animal behavior. Amidst dense stands of Archaeopteris, the first branching leaves form overlapping layers that trap humidity, alter wind patterns, and fragment sunlight into shifting mosaics on the forest floor. Paleoecological reconstructions indicate that this layering created microclimates with temperature differences of several degrees between the floor and mid-canopy levels. Such variability affected the metabolic rates and activity patterns of arthropods and amphibian precursors, concentrating both predators and prey into zones where energy and humidity were optimal. These layered environments also promoted fungal colonization on shaded surfaces, contributing to nutrient cycling and further complicating the visual and chemical cues within the forest. Hidden within pools and crevices, small aquatic organisms exploit the shadowed understory, revealing early trophic links between waterlogged niches and emergent vegetation. Fossilized microcrustaceans and early branchiopods, preserved in Devonian chert, demonstrate that shallow water pockets within the forest floor were teeming with life, providing a steady food source for semi-terrestrial predators. These microhabitats were ephemeral, often forming during seasonal flooding and disappearing during droughts, yet their presence shaped feeding strategies and hunting routes for larger arthropods and vertebrate progenitors. The interplay of aquatic and terrestrial microhabitats highlights the complexity of energy transfer within the first forests. Rising from damp soil, fungal pillars emerge like silent sentinels, hosting microbial communities that compete with plants for nutrients while subtly reshaping the microclimate. Fossil evidence from Devonian deposits shows prototaxites reaching heights of several meters, with hollow central structures allowing water and gas exchange, and surfaces colonized by cyanobacteria and early fungi. These pillars not only modified air movement and humidity distribution, but also provided vertical complexity that smaller predators exploited as cover or vantage points. The coexistence of massive fungi and towering trees created a three-dimensional architecture that magnified the labyrinthine quality of the forests. In narrow alleys between dense stems, predatory arthropods, small but lethal wait in ambush, relying on the visual and vibrational camouflage provided by the labyrinthine foliage. Fossil evidence of burrows and trackways indicates that creatures, like early scorpions and centipede relatives, specialized in these confined corridors, using slit sensilla and antennal mechanoreceptors to detect the faintest movements of prey. The interaction between the labyrinth's structure and predator strategy demonstrates that spatial complexity was as critical to survival as speed or strength, shaping evolutionary pathways that favored stealth, agility, and sensory specialization. Leaf surfaces glisten with dew, simultaneously nourishing epiphytic algae and creating reflective traps that amplify the disorientation of creatures navigating the dim corridors. Modern analogues of epiphytic growth on tree trunks suggest that such micro-ecosystems could alter light reflection and humidity in ways that affected predator-prey interactions. Paleobotanical reconstructions indicate that early leaves retained water in small depressions, serving as micro-reservoirs that supported both microbial life and tiny invertebrates, further increasing the density of obstacles and opportunities within these labyrinths. Navigation required not only instinct, but an intimate familiarity with the forest's unpredictable layout. Fallen trunks and intertwined branches form natural bridges and barriers, guiding movement, concentrating prey, and establishing micro-territories within this early forest maze. Trace fossils suggest that arthropods repeatedly used these linear structures, leaving overlapping trackways that map the first examples of consistent locomotion paths within a terrestrial ecosystem. These obstacles also funneled both predators and prey into predictable zones, setting the stage for evolutionary selection based on route memory, ambush strategies, and physical endurance. The labyrinth was both a trap and a guide, structuring behavior long before social or cognitive complexity evolved. When sunlight fades and darkness seeps across the forest floor, the forest hums with hidden activity, hinting that survival depends as much on navigation as on brute strength or speed. Sporadic sunlight glimmers across stems and leaves, creating fleeting glimpses of movement while the majority of life remains concealed. The combined effect of plant density, spore haze, and understory waterlogged zones establishes a world where perception is fractured, forcing all inhabitants to adapt to darkness, ambiguity, and vertical complexity as fundamental ecological constraints. The dense vegetation folds upon itself, revealing a world in which the architecture of plants dictated predator strategy, survival niches, and the rhythm of life itself, quietly suggesting that evolution would soon exploit these corridors for ever more specialized interactions between flora and fauna. The first forests were not merely a backdrop for life, they were active participants, shaping locomotion, hunting, and foraging, and hinting that the interplay between structure and survival would define the future of terrestrial ecosystems. From this twilight maze, the next phase of life's story emerges. Predators will confront one another more directly, and the plant-built labyrinth will become the proving ground for evolutionary innovation. Arachnid assassins in the understory. Where the forest corridors narrow and spore haze thickens, an early arachnid crouches on a fallen stem, legs poised to detect the faintest vibration in the leaf litter. The dense atmosphere hangs with humidity, trapping every sound and chemical particle, turning the understory into a three-dimensional hunting grid where stealth is paramount. Fossil trackways suggest these predators move deliberately, scanning the substrate for subtle disturbances, while their compact bodies allowed navigation through gaps barely wider than their own carapace. Every micro-movement, from a shifting frond to the passage of a tiny crustacean, becomes a potential cue, and the forest itself amplifies the sensory world of these silent hunters. Exoskeletons, dark and glistening, reveal segmentation designed for silent, deliberate movement, with specialized tarsal claws gripping uneven surfaces to prevent slipping on decaying stems and water-slicked roots. Micro-CT scans of early arachnid fossils indicate a flexible yet reinforced cuticle, with overlapping plates protecting vital organs while permitting precise articulation. Some limbs bear elongated spines that function as both tactile extensions and prey entanglers, illustrating an evolutionary balance between offense and defense. These structural adaptations allowed predators to traverse complex forest floors with both agility and discretion, minimizing energy expenditure while maximizing reach. Venom glands, preserved in exceptional Devonian fossils, suggest a biochemical sophistication capable of paralyzing prey within seconds, composed of peptide-rich secretions specialized for immobilization rather than digestion. Comparative studies with later scorpion and spider lineages indicate that this early venom targeted nervous and muscular systems, providing insight into how chemical predation shaped early terrestrial ecosystems. Traces of mineralized gland ducts in exceptionally preserved specimens reveal early experiments in venom delivery, hinting that these arachnids were among the first invertebrate predators to combine ambush tactics with biochemical weapons. Mechanoreceptors line the pedipalps and leg joints, allowing the smallest shift in air pressure or substrate to register across a sensory network attuned to the swamp's nuances. Slit sensilla, hair-like trichobothria, and fine vibrational sensors enable detection of prey without direct contact, converting minute oscillations into neural signals that trigger rapid strikes. Fossilized impressions and comparative anatomical modeling indicate that these systems were already highly integrated, suggesting that early arachnids relied as much on sensory finesse as on brute strength. This capability allowed them to hunt in near total darkness, exploiting niches inaccessible to less specialized predators. Hunting grounds often overlap with decaying plant matter, where moisture retains vibrations and scent molecules, providing a three-dimensional map of nearby organisms. Piles of fallen leaves, submerged roots, and spore-saturated detritus form both obstacles and conduits, guiding predator movement along repeatable paths. Observations of modern analogues show that arachnids prefer substrates that transmit vibrations efficiently, maximizing prey detection, and Devonian microfossil evidence indicates similar behavior patterns existed over 400 million years ago. These microhabitats are simultaneously food sources, predator arenas, and environmental filters, shaping the interactions of every organism within the labyrinthine understory. Juvenile arachnids mimic adult stalking behaviors, revealing early developmental strategies that fine-tuned predatory precision even at minimal body size. Growth series preserved in chert show proportional limb development, spine placement, and pedipalp articulation consistent with adult predatory tactics, suggesting that survival depended on rapid acquisition of hunting skills. These juveniles exploit micro-scale niches inaccessible to larger adults, feeding on smaller crustaceans and larvae, which reduces competition while reinforcing learning of stealth and strike coordination. Developmental mimicry in predation represents one of the earliest examples of ontogenetic behavioral continuity in terrestrial invertebrates. Interactions between predators reveal territoriality expressed through subtle leg displays, chemical markers, and aggressive posturing rather than direct combat. Trace fossil overlaps indicate avoidance behavior, with longer and deeper trackways correlating to dominance and reproductive potential. Chemical analyses of later arachnid relatives suggest that early analogues likely used pheromones to signal occupation of prime hunting corridors. This system reduces lethal conflicts, allowing multiple ambush specialists to coexist within the same understory labyrinth, demonstrating an early sophistication in behavioral ecology. Enveloped in a thickening fog of spores, these ambush specialists rely entirely on vibration, tactile feedback, and chemoreception to select prey. Light penetration falls below 5% in dense stands, forcing hunters to interpret signals from substrate movement, chemical trails, and even the subtle sway of nearby stems. Fossil evidence of repeated track patterns along branch intersections suggests that these arachnids memorized environmental layouts, optimizing ambush positions and energy expenditure. The twilight forest becomes a theater of patient predation, where success is determined by acute sensory perception and the ability to remain undetected. Footprints, burrows, and silk remnants preserved in Devonian strata demonstrate that early arachnids combined concealment, strategic movement, and environmental manipulation to maximize success. Silk fibers, rare but present in exceptional fossil beds, hint at early web-like structures used for prey detection or shelter rather than capture. Burrow depth and orientation reveal careful placement to intercept prey flow while avoiding flooding or predation. These adaptations illustrate how behavior and environmental interaction were co-evolving, with each corridor of the forest floor functioning as both stage and instrument in the predator's life. Every strike, pause, and withdrawal reflects evolutionary experimentation in a world where stealth and patience determine survival more than brute force. The integration of sensory sophistication, venom, and environmental mastery indicates a high level of ecological specialization unprecedented in terrestrial ecosystems of the time. Fossil evidence supports repeated innovation in hunting technique and habitat exploitation, underscoring that ambush predation shaped the selective pressures on prey and competitor species alike. Here, in the understory of the first forests, survival was a delicate balance of patience, timing, and environmental intelligence. From the murky undergrowth, the arachnids vanish into shadowed recesses, signaling that the balance of life is poised not only on land, but also in the waterlogged hollows below, hinting at the next phase where semi-aquatic predators will claim dominance. The first truly complex predator-prey interactions among arachnids leave a blueprint of innovation, demonstrating that the interplay of behavior, physiology, and environmental structure would continue to define terrestrial ecosystems. As these silent assassins retreat, the stage is set for life to extend its reach into the murky waters of the swamp, where new dangers and strategies await in a world still unfolding its evolutionary narrative. Waters black with armor and teeth, silent in the murky currents, armored fish glide, their heavy plates shimmering in diffuse sunlight filtered through suspended silt, each movement deliberate and measured. The swamp's shallow pools are a labyrinth of submerged stems, root tangles, and decaying plant matter, creating pockets of shadow that predators exploit for ambush. Fossilized placoderms, with articulated dermal plates, reveal an evolutionary balance between mobility and protection, allowing these early jawed vertebrates to patrol the water column with a combination of stealth and armor. Every ripple, every drifting particle, carries information about potential prey, turning even the faintest disturbance into a signal demanding attention. Silt clouds swirl with the slightest disturbance, and within them, placoderms lie in wait, jaws and sensory systems honed for sudden predatory strikes. Lateral line canals, preserved in exceptionally detailed fossils, trace the contours of the body and provide sensitivity to minute water movements, detecting struggling prey or the approach of competitors. Studies of Devonian sedimentology show that seasonal flooding frequently stirred these silt clouds, creating ephemeral hunting conditions where precision and timing could mean life or death. Predators exploit these dynamic microhabitats with astonishing skill, positioning themselves in shadows where prey is likely to stumble. Body armor, composed of overlapping dermal plates, protects both rivals and the chaotic debris of floodplain waters, acting as both shield and structural reinforcement. Micro-CT analysis of placoderm fossils demonstrates that armor thickness varies across the body, with cranial and thoracic regions maximized for protection while allowing flexibility in the tail and fins. These armored designs allowed predators to survive in habitats where collisions with driftwood, rocks, and other fish were frequent hazards, while also enabling dominance in intraspecific confrontations. Armor was not static. Evolutionary experimentation in plate morphology reflects an early interplay between defense, mobility, and energy efficiency. Jaw morphology reveals early experimentation in feeding mechanics, combining crushing, slicing, and ambush strategies adapted to murky, low-light conditions. Fossils of Bothrialepis and other placoderms indicate bite forces sufficient to crush mollusk shells, while jointed jaw elements allow rapid closure and slicing action for soft-bodied prey. Biomechanical reconstructions suggest that these jaws evolved independently of earlier anatostomes, indicating convergent evolution in predation strategies. The combination of jaw strength, rapid motion, and sensory precision made these fish apex predators in their waterlogged domains. Fins and tail musculature are arranged for precise bursts of acceleration, allowing predators to navigate complex underwater terrain and sudden obstacles. Fossil evidence shows well-developed pectoral fins with articulating lobes, providing stability when maneuvering around roots and submerged debris. Caudal fin morphology reveals a compromise between continuous propulsion and explosive thrust, enabling ambush predators to close in on unsuspecting prey within a fraction of a second. Locomotion in these early vertebrates reflects evolutionary experimentation with balancing speed, control, and stealth in a highly structured environment. Microhabitats form along submerged root tangles and decaying plant matter, concentrating prey and structuring predator territories within these shallow aquatic corridors. Small crustaceans, early amphibian larvae, and juvenile fish gather in these nutrient-rich areas, creating a dense food web that armored fish exploit. Analysis of sediment layers indicates repeated congregation of predators along these microhabitats, with overlapping tracks suggesting territoriality and site fidelity. These zones act as hunting theatres where the interplay of predator and prey is intensified by spatial constraints and resource concentration. Navigating the crowded currents, juvenile placoderms exhibit scaled-down armour and proportionally faster strikes, a strategy for survival in predator-saturated waters. Growth series preserved in chert beds show that juveniles occupy slightly different ecological niches than adults, minimizing direct competition while still practicing predation on smaller prey. Their lighter armor allows quicker reaction times, while the same jaw mechanics facilitate early mastery of ambush techniques. This ontogenetic partitioning demonstrates that even in the Devonian, life history strategies were finely tuned to ecological pressures, ensuring both survival and the transmission of predatory skill. Interactions between competing predators often involve display of armor ridges, lateral flaring, and circling movements to establish dominance without direct combat. Fossil evidence reveals overlapping resting traces and bite scars that suggest ritualized encounters rather than immediate lethal aggression. Such displays likely reduce mortality while allowing recognition of hierarchical status within confined aquatic corridors. Behavioral sophistication in these early vertebrates illustrates that intelligence and strategy, not just physical power, were essential to dominance in the murky water column. Trace fossils in siltstone reveal preserved bite marks, fin impressions, and resting positions, providing insight into hunting strategy, territory, and predator-prey dynamics. Bite marks on smaller fish and invertebrate shells illustrate repeated predation attempts and selectivity based on prey type. Fin impressions show positioning for ambush concealment, while resting traces reveal favored microhabitats. These fossilized interactions, preserved for over 400 million years, offer a remarkable window into the daily life of early aquatic hunters and the subtle tactics that govern survival. Shadows move with the drifting currents. Silhouetted shapes of lurking predators ripple across the silt, a testament to the constant, lethal tension beneath the water's surface. Every pool and submerged root becomes a potential trap, every shadow a stage for predation, underscoring the precarious balance of life in the Devonian wetlands. The combination of armor, sensory acuity, and ambush strategy defines a world where survival is contingent on mastering the interplay of structure, stealth, and the ever-shifting waterlogged environment. Where water meets earth in jagged mosaics, armored hunters retreat to shadowed recesses, signaling that the frontier between water and land is poised for experimentation, where creatures will test the edges of both realms, and the next phase of life's conquest begins. These semi-aquatic predators illustrate that evolutionary innovation extends beyond physiology into behavior, habitat exploitation, and ecological dominance. The murky depths, teeming with armored killers and silent hunters, set the stage for organisms poised to bridge the gap between water and land, a pivotal chapter in the relentless expansion of life across the Devonian world. Limbs in the mire, early tetrapods in peril. Emerging from shallow pools, the first tetrapods extend paddle-like limbs toward uncertain ground, every step a negotiation between buoyancy and gravity, testing the interface between water and land. Each limb presses into the soft, silt-laden mud, leaving impressions that hint at struggle and adaptation, while the surrounding swamp, choked with decaying plant matter, provides both refuge and peril. Fossil evidence of Ichthyostega and Acanthostega demonstrates a complex balance of limbs, tail, and body musculature, optimized for shallow water and brief terrestrial excursions. The murky margins of the swamp, where waterlogged soil gives way to emergent stems, create a dynamic, ever-shifting landscape that both constrains and shapes early tetrapod movement. Muscle and skeletal structure reveal early experimentation in weight support, with robust humeri and femora articulating to withstand uneven substrates. Joint morphology suggests limited rotation but remarkable strength, allowing these early pioneers to push against irregular roots, mud ridges, and decayed logs while maintaining balance. Fossils of limb bones show a combination of features for swimming and crawling, highlighting an evolutionary compromise. Limbs strong enough for terrestrial support, yet flexible enough for aquatic propulsion. The stresses of dual environment locomotion influence not only growth patterns, but also behavior, as tetrapods adapted strategies to minimize energy expenditure while navigating precarious terrain. Skin adaptations, from mucus secretion to keratinization, mitigate desiccation while allowing cutaneous respiration in humid, oxygen-poor environments. Microscopic studies of Devonian fossils suggest that early tetrapods relied partially on diffusion through moist skin to supplement lung breathing, a necessity in stagnant or hypoxic waters. The combination of epidermal moisture retention and rudimentary keratin layers would have provided a buffer against dehydration during terrestrial forays, while simultaneously protecting against abrasion from plant debris and silt. This dual function of skin reflects an early solution to the complex trade-offs imposed by life straddling two habitats. Predatory pressures remain omnipresent, with both aquatic hunters and lurking terrestrial ambush predators forcing constant vigilance and strategic movement. Placoderms, lungfish, and armored invertebrates patrol the water margins, while early arthropod predators hide in shadowed undergrowth, claws and pincers ready to seize vulnerable tetrapods. Observations from fossil assemblages show overlapping predator-prey distributions, indicating that early tetrapods operated in high-risk zones during feeding, migration, and rest. Behavioral strategies, such as choosing microhabitats close to cover or moving in short, calculated bursts, emerge as critical determinants of survival in this dual-threat environment. Flooded plant debris and silt-choked hollows create navigational challenges, shaping the tetrapod's gait, turning radius, and energy expenditure. Limbs splay to maintain stability across uneven substrates, while tails provide counterbalance and occasional propulsion. Sedimentological studies reveal that waterlogged forest floors were densely packed with fallen stems and mats of algae, requiring careful maneuvering to avoid entrapment or injury. Energy efficiency becomes paramount, as extended excursions over mud or through shallow water dramatically increase vulnerability to predation and desiccation. Young tetrapods navigate the margins of safety with partial tail propulsion, refining limb coordination while avoiding immediate threats. Smaller individuals show evidence of selective habitat use, favouring channels and shallow pools where armour and speed can compensate for inexperience. Growth series indicate that juvenile tetrapods gradually increase terrestrial locomotor competency as skeletal and muscular structures mature, a reflection of ontogenetic adaptation. By practicing both swimming and crawling in controlled microhabitats, these early vertebrates prepared for the broader challenges of the emergent land. Interactions among conspecifics show early social or competitive behaviours, from territorial posturing to cooperative microhabitat use. Fossil trackways and paired impressions suggest that tetrapods occasionally travelled in loose aggregations, perhaps seeking safety in numbers or negotiating access to limited resources. Posturing behaviours, such as lateral flaring and body alignment, may have reduced direct combat while establishing dominance hierarchies in crowded aquatic terrestrial interfaces. These interactions highlight that survival depended not only on physical adaptation, but also on behavioural sophistication, foreshadowing complex social dynamics in later terrestrial vertebrates. Impressions preserved in soft substrates reveal subtle shifts in weight distribution, pauses, and adjustments across mud and detritus, encoding the fine-scale mechanics of dual environment locomotion. Variations in stride length, paw placement, and tail angle illuminate strategies for maintaining balance, adjusting to obstacles, and conserving energy while avoiding predators. Detailed analysis of these fossilized movements provides rare insight into how early tetrapods evaluated terrain, applied force, and coordinated limbs during perilous transitions between water and land. Respiratory experimentation, with alternating use of gills, lungs, and cutaneous surfaces, reflects the evolutionary pressures of dual environment existence. Fossil evidence indicates that some tetrapods retained functional gills into late juvenile stages, while simultaneously developing lungs capable of extracting oxygen from air. Cutaneous respiration, especially in moist microhabitats, supplemented oxygen intake during terrestrial excursions. These adaptations collectively illustrate that early tetrapods were actively navigating the physiological trade-offs required to survive in habitats fluctuating between aquatic and terrestrial extremes. Dusk and microbial mats thickened simultaneously, turning each step into a gamble against both predators and disease-bearing organisms lurking in stagnant water. Fungal growths, bacterial films, and other microorganisms proliferated in warm, oxygen-poor pools, creating invisible hazards that could compromise skin, gills, and limb function. Paleoecological studies suggest that early tetrapods had to balance predation risk with microbial exposure, choosing movement patterns, resting sites, and hydration strategies to optimize survival. The interplay of biological and microbial threats underscores that the conquest of land was not only a matter of limbs and lungs, but also of navigating unseen ecological pressures. At the interface of water and newly emerged terrain, early tetrapods inch forward, proving that survival hinges on mastering threats both visible and invisible, foreshadowing the innovations that would ultimately allow vertebrates to claim terrestrial ecosystems. Each tentative step demonstrates the experimental nature of evolution, where locomotion, respiration, and behavior converge under the crucible of environmental pressure. In this complex interface, where silt, water, and predators combine with microbial hazards, life tests the limits of adaptability, setting the stage for the next phase. Organisms capable of venturing fully onto land, where entirely new challenges and opportunities await. The kingdom of rot. Shadows deepen under towering fungal columns, where mycelial networks stretch across the swamp floor, silently digesting plant matter and shaping the chemical landscape in ways invisible to most creatures. Fossils of prototaxites-like organisms reveal hollow stems rising meters above the ground, their massive bodies not only dominating the visual landscape, but also hosting complex microhabitats within. Every fallen stem, decomposing leaf, and soft patch of moss becomes a substrate for a hidden world of fungi, bacteria, and early protists, each contributing to nutrient cycling that sustains or poisons the surrounding life. The sheer scale of these fungal giants, towering over early tetrapods and arthropods alike, creates a claustrophobic environment where light, moisture, and chemical composition fluctuate unpredictably, shaping both behavior and survival. Odors of decay, both subtle and overpowering, hint at microbial activity that releases toxins and depletes oxygen in stagnant pools. Cyanobacterial blooms form dense mats, releasing sulfides and other byproducts that can suffocate small aquatic invertebrates and hinder amphibious tetrapods. Geochemical studies indicate that localized hypoxic zones formed rapidly during seasonal temperature peaks, creating invisible but lethal traps. Early vertebrates navigating these areas had to balance the risk of predation against the threat of microbial toxicity, demonstrating that evolution in the Devonian was as much about avoiding chemical hazards as it was about evading jaws or claws. Giant fungi, including early prototaxites-like forms, rise meters above the undergrowth, their hollow stems hosting countless microscopic organisms. Spores proliferate across the damp forest floor, colonizing new detritus almost immediately and ensuring a continuous cycle of decomposition. Some fungal mats may have stabilized soft soils, yet simultaneously released metabolites toxic to other organisms, creating a landscape that was both foundation and danger zone. Fossilized impressions of these stems suggest repeated trampling by early tetrapods and large arthropods, indicating that life was forced to negotiate the physical and chemical obstacles presented by these towering decomposers. Sludge-laden waters teem with microbial blooms that fluctuate seasonally, producing chemical gradients that influence predator, prey, and plant distribution. Early cyanobacteria and bacterial mats excreted substances that altered pH and oxygen availability, shaping microhabitats that only specialized organisms could exploit. Fossil evidence shows that invertebrate communities concentrated near oxygenated pockets, while amphibious tetrapods moved cautiously through peripheries, avoiding zones of lethal toxicity. These microbial processes acted as silent sculptors of the swamp ecosystem, subtly orchestrating the distribution and behavior of nearly every living organism. Decomposing plant mats act as both trap and refuge, concentrating nutrients while hiding small invertebrates and influencing foraging strategies. Arthropods and early tetrapods use these detritus zones for ambush or shelter, yet the very substances that attract life nutrients released during decay also harbour dangerous fungi and bacterial blooms. Chemical analyses of Devonian swamp sediments suggest that these mats created localized oxygen deficits while releasing toxins like phenols and aliphatic acids, challenging residents to navigate a perilous balance between nourishment and risk. These mosaics of rot dictate movement, feeding patterns, and the spatial dynamics of entire communities, highlighting the ecological power of decomposition. Chemical byproducts of decay, aliphatic acids, phenols, and sulfides create localized toxicity zones, challenging even the hardiest early tetrapods and arthropods. Fossilized remains of vertebrates and arthropods occasionally show signs of lesions or chemical erosion, suggesting chronic exposure to these hazardous microhabitats. Modern analogues of microbial mats indicate that chemical surges can happen rapidly, sometimes overwhelming small animals within hours. The invisible chemistry of decay emerges as a dominant evolutionary force, shaping behavior, habitat, selection, and even reproductive strategies in these primeval swamps. Fungal spores, buoyed by humid air and water currents, colonize fresh detritus rapidly, ensuring constant renewal of decay zones. Observations of spore dispersal in comparable modern fungi suggest that spores can travel meters with minimal airflow, colonizing new substrates and perpetuating the cycle of nutrient turnover. This continual renewal prevents stagnation, but also guarantees that early tetrapods and invertebrates must constantly adapt to shifting chemical and physical landscapes. The interplay between fungal reproduction and organismal behavior illustrates a dynamic feedback loop where the silent work of decomposers dictates opportunities and threats. Interactions between fungi and microbes generate complex biochemical feedback loops that accelerate decomposition, altering sediment composition and water chemistry. Fungal enzymes break down lignin and cellulose, while bacterial communities metabolize secondary byproducts, releasing sulfides and acids that further destabilize the substrate. Such interactions not only recycle nutrients, but also create microhabitats hostile to unadapted organisms, forcing selective pressures on tetrapods, arthropods, and plants alike. Paleoecological evidence shows that these feedback loops could trigger cascading effects, amplifying the lethality of certain swamp patches while concentrating life in others. Evidence from geochemical isotopes reveals spikes in carbon and sulfur during peak decay events, reflecting ecosystem-wide influence on nutrient cycling. Carbon isotopic signatures suggest that decaying plant matter contributed disproportionately to local food webs, while sulfur peaks correspond with microbial sulfate reduction and hypoxic stress in waterlogged pools. These chemical markers provide a quantitative window into the hidden dynamics of decomposition, revealing that rot was not merely a background process, but a driving ecological force shaping both life and habitat in the Devonian. The swamp floor, a mosaic of rot, water, and surviving life, illustrates that even invisible processes exert formidable evolutionary pressure on both flora and fauna. Decay zones favour opportunistic species, reward behavioural flexibility, and punish miscalculation, creating a crucible where evolution tests locomotion, feeding, and sensory adaptations. The omnipresent interplay of fungi, microbes, chemical gradients, and living organisms demonstrates that the kingdom of rot is as powerful as any predator, quietly structuring ecosystems from the bottom up. Within this kingdom of rot, life persists, adapts, and innovates, demonstrating that the unseen forces of decay are as potent as predators in shaping the Devonian landscape, and hinting at the escalating arms races between plants and the earliest insects that will soon exploit this nutrient-rich world. Every fungal column, every microbial bloom, and every patch of decomposing leaf litter contributes to an ecosystem in constant flux, emphasizing that survival in these swamps requires vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to exploit the very processes that could just as easily kill. The stage is now set for a new chapter in Devonian evolution, where the interplay of nutrient availability, decay, and predation will drive unprecedented diversification and ecological experimentation. Chemical warfare in the green swamp. Ripples of chemical signals radiate from thick fronds, warning insects of toxins and guiding them toward less defended foliage, transforming the seemingly tranquil Devonian swamp into an invisible battlefield. Fossilized leaf surfaces and resin-coated stems suggest that early plants produced an astonishing array of deterrents, from bitter-tasting phenolics to resinous compounds designed to slow, trap, or repel hungry arthropods. Each insect approaching a plant faces not just a physical challenge, but a chemical gauntlet where a single misstep can lead to immobilization, poisoning, or death. The swamp is alive with these silent signals, and survival depends as much on detecting and interpreting them as on speed, size, or strength. Arthropods, such as primitive myriapods and early beetle-like creatures, test each leaf with sensitive mouthparts, encountering armor, spines, and deterrent compounds that challenge digestion and discourage repeated feeding. Fossil evidence reveals parallel evolution of feeding appendages adapted to scrape, pierce, or circumvent protective tissues, demonstrating that chemical warfare was not one-sided. Over successive generations, insects evolved detoxifying enzymes capable of neutralizing plant alkaloids, while mechanical defenses like exoskeletal reinforcement allowed them to chew through tougher or resin-coated surfaces. These adaptations underscore the dynamic tension in the Devonian swamp, where every organism must constantly innovate to survive. Sap exudates, bitter acids, and resin-like secretions coat stems and leaves, creating invisible barriers that influence feeding patterns, movement, and habitat preference. Chemical analyses of Devonian plant fossils indicate that concentrations of alkaloids, phenolics, and terpenoids were sufficient to affect even small vertebrates exploring these zones. Pools of water near decaying vegetation often contain dissolved plant toxins, adding another layer of risk to amphibious tetrapods navigating the swamp. The combination of chemical deterrents and environmental hazards creates microhabitats in which only specialized organisms thrive, revealing a subtle but powerful form of ecological control. Leaf architecture and cuticle thickness vary dramatically across species, reflecting evolutionary experimentation with both mechanical and chemical defenses. Some leaves feature waxy coatings, resistant to insect penetration, while others rely on serrated edges, toughened fibers, or glandular secretions. Fossilized cuticle impressions show microscopic patterns that suggest targeted defense strategies, implying that plant morphology and chemistry were finely tuned to the feeding behavior of their local herbivores. In this arena, plant innovation is not passive. It actively shapes the behavior, distribution, and evolutionary trajectory of the arthropods it deters. Microhabitats within dense vegetation concentrate chemical warfare, producing pockets where herbivores either adapt rapidly or perish. Isotopic analyses indicate that certain zones were enriched in defensive compounds, likely due to slower decay or higher production of secondary metabolites, while neighboring areas offered relative safety. Insects demonstrate microhabitat selection, moving cautiously between nutrient-rich but dangerous patches and chemically safer zones. This patchwork of risk and opportunity imposes selective pressures that accelerate evolutionary innovation, favoring individuals that can navigate the chemical landscape with precision. Fossilized feeding traces, chewed edges, and gut contents reveal early insect preferences, avoidance behaviors, and specialized adaptations to toxic plants. Gut morphology and jaw structure suggest a remarkable capacity for processing secondary metabolites without lethal effects, a feature that distinguishes certain lineages from their less adaptable contemporaries. These adaptations are mirrored in the fossil record by variations in leaf damage patterns, where some species exhibit uniform grazing avoidance and others leave deep, exploratory holes. The interplay between plant chemical defenses and arthropod countermeasures forms the basis for a microscopic arms race that shapes entire ecological communities. Biochemical analysis of plant tissues indicates a diverse array of secondary metabolites, from alkaloids to phenolics, each targeting herbivory in distinct ways. Alkaloids interfere with neural transmission in small arthropods, while phenolics bind proteins and slow digestion, and resinous compounds act as both physical and chemical deterrents. The distribution of these compounds within individual plants and across species creates a multi-layered defensive network, ensuring that no single herbivore can monopolize resources without adaptation. The chemical language of plants thus becomes a central driver of behavior, evolution, and ecological structure. Territorial competition among insects drives innovation in exoskeletal thickness, enzymatic detoxification, and behavioral avoidance. Fossilized trackways reveal patterns of movement that suggest insects not only responded to chemical cues, but also competed for the safest and most nutritious feeding grounds. Some species evolve rapid escape responses, while others exploit microhabitats where plant defenses are less concentrated. These interactions amplify the selective pressures on both plants and insects, accelerating the pace of coevolution and shaping the swamp's complex food webs. Seasonal cycles of growth, decay, and chemical potency create a shifting battlefield, requiring constant adaptation from both flora and fauna. Peaks in plant metabolite production coincide with periods of insect activity, suggesting temporal synchronization that maximizes deterrence when herbivory risk is highest. Conversely, insects exploit periods of lower chemical intensity to feed and reproduce, illustrating that survival is contingent not only on spatial awareness, but also on timing and environmental sensitivity. These cyclical dynamics emphasize that chemical warfare in the green swamp is not static, but a highly responsive, evolving system. The interplay of chemical defenses and physical armament highlights an invisible yet powerful dimension of survival, shaping feeding strategies, movement, and predator-prey interactions. The swamp is a living laboratory where each adaptation, whether in plant tissue, arthropod enzyme, or behavioral response, contributes to the survival of species navigating this chemically charged environment. Chemical and physical arms races ripple through trophic levels, influencing everything from microbial mats in the detritus to the behavior of early tetrapods seeking insects for food. Within this chemical theater, life adapts in real time, demonstrating that the contest between plants and insects is as much molecular as it is physical, and foreshadowing the emergence of specialized predators whose evolution will depend on navigating the toxins, traps, and defenses that define the green swamp. Every bite, avoidance, and adaptation illustrates that chemical tension is not a mere backdrop, but a central force shaping the Devonian ecosystem. These invisible struggles set the stage for a future in which predators, herbivores, and plants will continue to refine strategies of offense and defense, heralding an escalation in ecological complexity and the rise of more specialized terrestrial life. Ground shadows, the hunters that never missed. Mud squelches beneath enormous, jointed limbs as predators navigate the labyrinth of decaying stems, hunting with a precision born of evolutionary pressure. Fossil evidence from trackways and limb impressions reveals the astonishing efficiency of these creatures, their segmented exoskeletons optimized for stability and speed on the treacherously soft swamp floor. Each movement is calculated. A careful placement of limbs avoids slipping in the saturated substrate while maintaining readiness to strike at unsuspecting prey. Even the slightest misstep can cost the predator both a meal and safety, highlighting the constant tension in this Devonian arena where life is measured in centimeters and fractions of seconds. Armored segments glint faintly under filtered sunlight, revealing structural adaptations designed to absorb impact and resist counterattacks. Calcified exoskeleton plates, reinforced joints, and overlapping armor not only protect vital organs, but also allow rapid flexion and extension during pursuit. Comparative studies of arthropod fossils suggest that such armor was complemented by flexible spines and interlocking plates, balancing protection with mobility. In the swamp's chaotic landscape, this combination of defense and agility defines which predators dominate, emphasizing that evolutionary innovation is never purely structural, but deeply functional. Vibrations ripple through saturated soil, signaling the approach of unsuspecting prey to sensory organs evolved for detecting the faintest tremor. Hairs and mechanoreceptors along the limbs and abdomen translate minute oscillations in mud or water into information about distance, size, and movement. Fossilized impressions of these sensory structures suggest remarkable specialization, providing predators with a near-perfect awareness of their surroundings without visual input. In a world of low light and dense vegetation, such adaptations allow hunters to strike with precision, making stealth as crucial as strength or speed. Impressions left in ancient silt preserve the choreography of stalking, leaping, and retreat, capturing a fossilized dance of predator and hunted. Trackways show rapid dashes toward prey, followed by sudden pauses, a tactical combination of observation and explosive movement. The spatial distribution of these traces indicates that predators were selective, exploiting terrain features to maximize success. Fossilized mud patterns reveal how these hunters coordinated locomotion with environmental cues, turning every ridge, puddle, or fallen stem into a tactical advantage. Mandibles and clawed appendages exhibit specialized mechanics for piercing, grasping, or crushing, demonstrating lethal efficiency in constrained swamp corridors. Analysis of jaw structure suggests forces capable of penetrating tough arthropod exoskeletons or immobilizing small vertebrates. Fossilized prey remnants show bite patterns consistent with ambush predation, illustrating how predators leveraged both chemical cues and physical dexterity. Every strike reflects an evolutionary solution honed over generations to exploit the vulnerabilities of co-inhabiting species. Herbivorous arthropods and juvenile tetrapods adjust movement patterns instinctively, illustrating the influence of these hunters on prey behavior and ecosystem flow. Fossilized burrows, escape traces, and feeding marks indicate prey avoidance strategies, suggesting that predatory pressure reshaped not only individual behavior but the spatial ecology of the swamp. Prey animals evolved heightened sensitivity to vibrations, rapid directional changes, and selective feeding to reduce encounters with hunters. This dynamic reinforces the concept that predator-prey interactions are reciprocal, each innovation in one group driving adaptive responses in the other. Shallow hollows and dense vegetation create micro-territories where individual predators optimize their hunting zones for energy efficiency and minimal competition. Fossilized trackways demonstrate repeated use of certain paths and ambush points, hinting at territoriality and learned familiarity with local terrain. These microhabitats also intersect with chemical landscapes produced by plants, creating complex matrices of risk and opportunity. Dominance is thus not merely a function of size or strength, but of spatial intelligence and environmental mastery. Speed, sensory acuity, and armor thickness combine to form evolutionary trade-offs that dictate dominance in swamp floors rife with danger. Larger predators with thicker armor move more slowly, while smaller, lighter hunters sacrifice protection for rapid strikes. Fossil comparisons reveal a spectrum of morphological strategies, each tailored to different niches and prey types. These trade-offs highlight that survival in the Devonian swamps required an intricate balance of physical, behavioral, and environmental adaptation, reflecting the relentless experimentation of evolution. Sudden floods, collapsing mud banks, and shifting plant debris demonstrate that even perfected predation offers no immunity against the swamp's capriciousness. Trackways abruptly end in sediment layers indicative of rapid inundation, while disarticulated fossils reveal the destructive force of environmental instability. These events underscore that the true arbiter of survival was often the swamp itself, capable of claiming lives regardless of skill or specialization. Predators are thus caught between the challenge of hunting and the unpredictability of their own habitat, a tension that shapes evolution as much as predation. Twilight shadows stretch across leaf-littered ground, emphasizing that environmental volatility, not just prey, governs life and death in this primordial arena. The interplay of physical prowess, sensory sophistication, and strategic thinking allows hunters to dominate temporarily, yet even the most adept are vulnerable to mud collapses, floods, and silt entrapment. Fossil evidence reminds us that dominance is ephemeral, a fleeting victory in a world dictated by forces far beyond the control of any single species. Silent hunters retreat into the recesses of mud, water, and fallen stems, revealing that dominance in the Devonian swamp was a fleeting achievement, always threatened by the ground itself. Their survival depended not only on mastery of prey, but also on constant adaptation to environmental instability, foreshadowing future pressures that would drive the evolution of amphibians and early tetrapods capable of exploiting both land and water. In this shadowed world, where precision, speed, and resilience collide with unpredictability, the swamp itself emerges as a relentless sculptor of life, setting the stage for organisms that must confront not just rivals, but the very instability of the ground beneath their feet. Storms, floods, and dying waters. Water churns through the flooded hollows, uprooting stems and depositing silt in chaotic patterns that transform the landscape in a single night. Fossil sediment layers reveal repeated inundations, each layering debris that records both destruction and renewal. Early tetrapods and arthropods are forced into frantic relocations, navigating unstable terrain where every step could plunge them into a murky trap. In these moments, the swamp demonstrates that even the most capable hunters or resilient plants remain at the mercy of elemental forces, and that survival hinges on flexibility as much as strength. Giant raindrops hammer the canopy, creating torrents that wash over leaf litter and obscure trails of both predator and prey. Trackways captured in silt demonstrate how creatures adjusted their gait to avoid slipping, while others were swept into new microhabitats by the relentless flow. Comparative analysis of these patterns reveals an evolutionary dialogue between organism and environment. Species that survived repeated floods exhibit anatomical refinements, while others vanish without a trace. In this interplay, the violent rhythms of climate become selective pressures, shaping ecosystems as profoundly as any predator. Oxygen levels plummet in stagnant pools, forcing fish and early tetrapods to exploit temporary surface access or perish. Fossilized gill structures indicate repeated adaptations to hypoxia, while limb morphology shows evidence of behavioral experimentation, including short bursts onto exposed mudflats or retreat to microchannels with higher oxygen levels. Such physiological flexibility underscores a principle that would define terrestrial evolution. Survival depends on exploiting fleeting opportunities in rapidly changing conditions, where lethality arises as often from chemistry as from predators. Sediment cores reveal layers of debris that mark repeated inundations, each reshaping microhabitats for generations of organisms. Plant stems and root mats become both shelter and obstacle, creating labyrinthine channels that influence predator-prey dynamics. Evidence of selective transport benthic invertebrates relocated while larger predators remained stranded illustrates that these storms act as ecological editors, rewriting the rules of competition and survival with every deluge. The Devonian swamp is therefore not static, but a living archive of environmental pressure, where only adaptable life endures. Floodwaters carry chemical residues from decaying vegetation, creating pockets of toxicity that test resilience and adaptability. Microbial blooms thrive in oxygen-depleted areas, releasing gases and compounds that render sections of the swamp temporarily uninhabitable. Fossil analysis of arthropod exoskeletons shows damage from acidic microenvironments, while early tetrapod remains suggest strategic avoidance behaviors. These chemical and biological pressures compound the physical dangers of floods, demanding that survival strategies integrate both environmental awareness and physiological tolerance. Burrowing behavior and temporary retreats become critical survival strategies for both arthropods and vertebrates. Fossilized burrows and trackways indicate repeated occupation, revealing that some species used subterranean refuges to escape torrents or hypoxic surface waters. These behaviors, coupled with anatomical traits such as stronger limbs or more flexible exoskeletons, highlight an essential truth. In the Devonian swamp, refuge and timing are as vital as predation or locomotion. Adaptation becomes a behavioral as well as structural enterprise. Currents and mudslides selectively redistribute nutrients, favoring certain plant species while eliminating others, altering the ecological mosaic. Analysis of plant fossil assemblages shows cycles of dominance and collapse, with pioneer species appearing after every major disturbance. This dynamic restructuring shapes habitat complexity, influencing the distribution of arthropods and vertebrates alike. Swamp inhabitants must negotiate these shifting resources while maintaining a position against both competitors and environmental hazards, illustrating the interconnectedness of life and catastrophe. Evidence from fossilized gill structures and limb articulation suggests adaptive responses to fluctuating aquatic environments. Gill plates indicate expansions for oxygen extraction during hypoxic events, while limb joints reflect repeated experimentation with substrate navigation under water-saturated conditions. These subtle anatomical innovations reveal the early stages of evolutionary experimentation that would eventually permit full terrestrialization. In the face of environmental volatility, life experiments, adapts, and records success in the fossil archive. Storm-driven erosion exposes ancient prey and predator remains, providing a stark record of mortality and opportunity in the Devonian swamp. Partial skeletons, scattered exoskeletons, and sedimentary impressions tell stories of creatures overwhelmed by floods, of predators who miscalculated timing, and of opportunistic survivors who exploited the chaos. This continuous cycle of death and renewal acts as both teacher and editor for evolution, producing selective pressures that surpass even predation in their intensity. Each storm reshapes the swamp not only physically, but genetically and behaviorally. As waters recede, survivors emerge, exhibiting anatomical refinements that hint at the innovations necessary for thriving in a world defined by instability. Limbs adapted for traction, gills for oxygen extraction, and behavioral strategies for timing and retreat all combine to allow life to persist despite repeated catastrophes. The swamp, though violent and capricious, becomes a crucible of evolutionary experimentation, forging traits that will enable life to endure in more terrestrial habitats. Survival here is defined not by dominance, but by responsiveness, resilience, and the ability to exploit fleeting conditions. From the devastation wrought by floods and hypoxic waters, life adapts and innovates, revealing that evolutionary ingenuity often arises from necessity and danger. The creatures of the Devonian swamp demonstrate that success is provisional and contingent on both vigilance and flexibility, and that the earliest vertebrates and arthropods were already learning the art of surviving environmental extremes. Amid this chaos, anatomical innovations begin to hint at the future. Limbs capable of negotiating both water and mud, respiratory systems balancing efficiency with risk, and behaviors calibrated to anticipate catastrophe. These adaptations foreshadow a world where life will move beyond the swamp's caprice, shaping new ecological landscapes on land, while the lessons learned in flood and silt lay the foundation for the next wave of evolutionary conquest. The body's preparing for flight. Muscles contract beneath thickened exoskeleton plates, allowing early insects to spring from waterlogged substrates with startling agility, their small bodies momentarily defying the constraints of gravity. Fossils reveal reinforced thoracic segments and sclerotized cuticles, providing both stability and the structural foundation necessary for future wing attachment. These features indicate that even before the evolution of true wings, insects were already experimenting with rapid, controlled movement across complex terrain, responding to predators and environmental instability with coordinated leaps and climbs. Survival in the swamp demanded not just speed, but precision, and these anatomical predaptations illustrate evolution testing the limits of form and function. Segments of the thorax show ridges and articulations that paleontologists identify as early signs of wing-supportive architecture. Exoskeletal reinforcements distribute mechanical stress during jumps and glides, and in some fossils, fine attachment points suggest muscles capable of supporting small proto-wings. Though incapable of sustained flight, these structures demonstrate an evolutionary trial stage, creatures preparing the blueprint for eventual mastery of the air. Such experiments highlight how structural innovation often precedes its full functional expression, a principle that repeats across the history of life. Sensor arrays along antennae and cerci detect minute vibrations in soil and plant matter, allowing these proto-aerial insects to anticipate predators or locate elevated refuges. Microscopic impressions in fossilized specimens suggest chemoreception and mechanoreception were already highly refined, enabling rapid decision-making when danger approached. These sensory capabilities function as a rehearsal for coordinated flight navigation, foreshadowing the sophisticated orientation systems of later winged insects. By enhancing environmental awareness, these organs increase survival odds and create selective pressure for additional mobility innovations. Jointed limbs pivot in ways that reveal repeated experimentation with leaps, climbs, and short-distance glides across stems, leaves, and decaying plant matter. Fossil trackways capture subtle angles and flexion patterns, providing evidence of repeated trials in balancing force, trajectory, and timing. Such mechanical experimentation illustrates that early insects were not merely passive participants in the swamp. They actively explored new physical dimensions, probing the boundaries between ground locomotion and vertical escape. These behaviors represent incremental steps toward aerial competence, even in a world still dominated by terrestrial threats. Fossilized imprints capture the angles and flexion of proto-wings, showing preliminary aerodynamic trials long before true flight existed. Thin, membranous extensions emerge along thoracic margins, sometimes with delicate veins suggesting internal support structures. Though incapable of powered flight, these extensions likely assisted in stabilizing jumps, controlling descent from stems, or gliding between plants. This evidence underscores the iterative nature of evolution. Small, functional experiments in morphology create the foundation for entirely new modes of existence. Behavioral patterns inferred from trackways and burrows indicate that early insects exploited vertical escape routes, climbing stems, or leaping onto elevated plant platforms to avoid predators. Such strategies would later become essential in the transition to aerial life, demonstrating that mobility innovations often originate as survival responses to predation pressures. Vertical exploration also expanded ecological opportunities, allowing insects to exploit niches inaccessible to less mobile competitors. The swamp thus functioned not only as a selective crucible, but also as a launchpad for experimentation in three-dimensional movement. Exoskeletal pigments and reflective surfaces may have enhanced predator avoidance, camouflaging movement against decaying plant matter or signaling danger to conspecifics. Fossilized cuticle patterns suggest that color and texture adaptations were integral to survival, complementing behavioral and anatomical strategies. In a landscape of stalked ferns, microbial mats, and looming arthropod predators, even subtle visual cues could determine life or death. Such adaptations reveal the interconnectedness of morphology, behavior, and environment in driving evolutionary experimentation. Musculature adaptations indicate repeated bursts of energy expenditure, a prelude to sustained aerial locomotion in later lineages. Fossil evidence of enlarged thoracic muscle attachment sites suggests that early insects were capable of rapid, forceful movements, supporting jumps, glides, and short-term hovering maneuvers. These repeated exertions likely imposed selective pressures on respiratory efficiency and energy metabolism, fostering adaptations that would eventually enable true powered flight. The energy-intensive nature of these movements reinforces the idea that evolution experiments within the constraints of necessity. The integration of respiratory efficiency with mobility demonstrates selective pressure balancing oxygen intake and increased activity. Tracheal systems in fossils show branching patterns consistent with enhanced oxygen delivery, allowing bursts of activity that were critical for predator evasion and substrate navigation. These respiratory refinements complement structural adaptations, revealing a coordinated suite of innovations designed to maximize survival in a hostile, unpredictable environment. In this interplay between anatomy and physiology, early insects begin to master the principles underlying aerial mobility. As these proto-flight adaptations accumulate, early insects transform from constrained ground dwellers into creatures poised to exploit vertical space with increasing sophistication. Every anatomical refinement, thoracic reinforcements, sensory arrays, muscular enhancements, and proto-wings represents a cumulative response to selective pressures in the swamp. Though true flight has yet to emerge, these insects have already begun mastering the air indirectly, through jumps, climbs, and glides that extend their reach above predators and competitors. The swamp, a crucible of floods, predators, and chemical challenges, simultaneously becomes a laboratory for evolutionary experimentation. Through gradual tweaks in anatomy and instinct, the first hint of mastery over the vertical dimension emerges, a prelude to the skies that await, where entirely new ecological challenges and opportunities will redefine life's possibilities. In these early innovators, we witness the blueprint of flight being drafted, exoskeletons and muscles, sensors and behavioral strategies, all converging to create organisms capable of transcending the limits of the ground. The lessons of floods, predators, and chemical dangers converge in a single principle. Adaptation is both iterative and integrative, and life, even in its smallest forms, is already preparing to conquer an entirely new dimension, the open air above the Devonian swamp, the final stillness before wings. A hush settles across the murky wetlands, as if the swamp itself is pausing to watch the next act of life unfold. The sun, low on the horizon, throws long shadows across waterlogged soil, and the towering fungal columns glimmer like silent sentinels in the thick, humid air. Oxygen levels fluctuate in the shallow pools, sometimes peaking at nearly 35% during daylight photosynthesis and dipping dangerously low under dense canopies at night, creating pockets of suffocating hazard for the creatures below. Tiny proto-insects cling to plant stems and decaying matter, their exoskeletons glinting wetly in the dim light, muscles coiled in readiness for movements that will one day be perfected into the first wings. Every still surface conceals a world in motion. Minute tremors ripple through silt, unseen predators hover in patience, and chemical gradients whisper the story of survival yet to be fully written. Stalks of primitive plants glisten with dew, their tips trembling under invisible currents of air that signal nothing and everything at once. Lycophytes, rhiniophytes, and early fern-like taxa dominate the undergrowth, their stiffened stems forming labyrinths through which animals must navigate. Each collision with decaying debris or fungal structure presents both opportunity and danger. A resting proto-insect might be crushed, or a juvenile predator might find nourishment in a hapless victim. Nutrient-rich soils, saturated with the detritus of millions of years of plant and microbial decay, allow dense clusters of flora to thrive, but also channel water and air in ways that create ephemeral microclimates, shaping the very strategies of movement that these tiny pioneers rely upon. The swamp's architecture is simultaneously cradle and cage, a network that nurtures yet restricts. Beneath the water's opaque surface, proto-insects cling to stems and detritus, their limbs adapted for gripping, while respiratory openings balance oxygen intake with water conservation. Morphological innovations in tracheal spacing, limb articulation, and muscle fiber orientation reveal evolutionary experiments long before the advent of flight. Some species possess elongated cerci, or finely tuned antennae, capable of detecting subtle vibrations in both water and soil, anticipating danger with astonishing precision. The murky, suspended silt diffuses light, creating a twilight environment that favors sensory awareness over visual acuity, and life adapts accordingly, honing strategies that will underpin aerial mastery in generations to come. Fungal towers release clouds of spores into the heavy air, a gentle shroud that muffles sound and isolates creatures within pockets of microhabitat. Each spore burst introduces both nutrients and competition. Detritivores consume what they can. Proto-predators track the movements of those drawn to the bounty, and chemical signals propagate through the water and soil to guide behavior over meters of terrain. Fungi such as prototaxites, some towering over 8 meters, dominate the landscape visually and chemically, secreting acids and metabolites that alter soil composition and indirectly sculpt the evolutionary pressures faced by the first terrestrial arthropods. Life moves around these living monuments with stealth and calculation, mapping its tiny world with extraordinary subtlety. Microbial mats swell with chemical energy, producing gradients that guide movement while simultaneously imposing toxicity. Cyanobacterial blooms shift oxygen concentrations diurnally, generating micro-oxic zones that force small organisms to calculate risk and timing precisely. Proto-insects and early crustacean-like arthropods demonstrate behavioral plasticity, avoiding lethal zones while exploiting nutrient-rich margins. These mats also stabilize fine sediments, allowing plants to anchor but simultaneously limiting rapid locomotion, forcing evolutionary innovation in grasping limbs, flexible tarsi, and exploratory behaviors, traits that will prove foundational for the first airborne ventures. Predators lie in wait, motionless on the forest floor, their armored exoskeletons perfectly camouflaged against leaf, litter, and mud. Paleoscorpius and other arachnid-like forms rely on chemical and vibrational cues to detect prey, executing strikes with split-second timing. The quiet of the swamp amplifies every disturbance. A ripple in a water puddle, a twitch of a stem, a vibration along a fungal stalk. Success is dictated less by speed and more by sensory acuity, reinforcing a principle that will persist into the evolution of wings. The integration of environmental information, behavior, and anatomical refinement. Air bubbles rising from decaying organic matter disturb the surface only momentarily, reminders that the swamp teeters on the threshold between stasis and chaos. Anaerobic decomposition produces hydrogen sulfide and methane pockets, creating toxic zones lethal to unadapted creatures. Yet these same processes enrich adjacent microhabitats, delivering nutrients for algae, bacteria, and detritivores. Life in the Devonian swamp thus exists in an oscillation between lethality and opportunity, an intricate balance that trains organisms in both caution and opportunism, qualities that will later enable exploration of the aerial dimension. Veins of moisture wind through saturated soils, shaping both terrain and the strategies of those navigating it. Minute topographic variations form channels, puddles, and micro-islands, influencing the locomotor decisions of proto-insects and early arthropods. Limbs are tested repeatedly against viscous mud, slippery detritus, and fragile plant material, leading to incremental morphological refinements. Joint flexibility, claw curvature, and cuticular texture evolve under constant selective pressure. The swamp's physical complexity becomes an architect of behavior and form, a crucible in which flight's precursors are quietly rehearsed. A flicker of movement antennae, cerci, or a brief jump disturbs the rhythm of the swamp, hinting at energy poised for release. These subtle motions serve as both communication and rehearsal. Proto-insects engage in small leaps, controlled rotations, and body extensions that mimic aerial mechanics on the ground. Muscle groups strengthen in repeated, low-risk movements. Neural circuits refine timing and coordination, and sensory organs calibrate for spatial awareness, preparing life for the leap into the sky even before wings exist. Light seeps from the sky, leaving only hints of motion, and shadows coalesce into abstract forms, merging biology and environment into a single tableau of anticipation. Light filters through dense canopies in scattered beams, illuminating fungal towers, waterlogged depressions, and clusters of miniature life. Every organism, from microscopic decomposers to armored hunters, is ensnared in this suspended moment, caught between evolution's pressure and the swamp's quiet. There is a sense that the entire ecosystem holds its breath, waiting for the next evolutionary breakthrough that will change the dynamics of life above and below the water alike. In this pregnant silence, the swamp holds its breath, carrying the weight of evolutionary experimentation and preparing the stage for a world where the first wings will cut through the Devonian air and transform ecosystems forever. Each trembling plant, every poised insect, and all the stillness of the waterlogged forest underscore the extraordinary interplay between environment and adaptation. From these quiet, saturated moments arises the blueprint for flight, a promise that life's next conquest will take to the skies, altering the very structure of swamps and forests, and ushering in the dawn of the Carboniferous, when air ceases to be empty and the world above becomes a new frontier for evolution. In the stillness of the Devonian swamps, we glimpse a world where life's ingenuity is measured in survival, adaptation, and daring experiments on the edge of air and land. Shadows of armored hunters, the hum of chemical battles, and the first stirrings of flight remind us that evolution is both brutal and breathtaking. These wetlands, at once nurturing and merciless, shaped the very blueprint of terrestrial life. As the mist lifts and the swamp falls silent, we are left with the memory of a world poised on the brink of transformation, raw, primeval, and impossibly alive. If you were captivated by this journey, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments below.